Aliens came, not with fire, not with armies, but with silence. And in one single night, they reached into every corner of Earth and stole something far more dangerous than weapons. They stole our memory. Every book, every archive, every name of every hero who ever bled for this planet, gone. They believed a species without its past was a species without a spine. They were about to learn the most terrifying lesson in galactic history. Welcome to HFY Endurance Tales. If this hits you deep, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop in the comments. What would you fight for if they erased everything you ever knew? Because this journey is just beginning, and humanity is about to write a new chapter the entire galaxy will fear forever. The morning of March 4th, 2187, began like any other across the American Midwest. Commander Brett Calloway was halfway through his second cup of coffee at Fort Harlow Military Complex in central Kansas when his tablet went blank. Not dead, blank. Every file, every document, every saved note reduced to white emptiness. He tapped it twice, frowned, and looked up at the base television mounted on the break room wall. The news anchor was speaking, but her eyes were hollow, like a woman reading from a script she no longer understood. Reports are coming in from across the globe, she said slowly. The historical records of all kinds have vanished. Brett set down his coffee. Outside, the morning sky was the same pale blue it always was. Birds scattered over the empty Kansas fields. Everything looked normal. Everything felt catastrophically wrong. He grabbed his radio. "Hayes, you up?" Sergeant Daniel Hayes responded immediately, his voice tight. "My grandfather's war journal. I had it on my bunk last night. It's gone. Not stolen. Gone. Like it was never printed." Brett moved into the hallway. Soldiers were emerging from quarters with identical expressions. That specific human confusion, sitting somewhere between disbelief and fury. Private Aaron Mercer stood holding an empty picture frame, the photograph of his grandmother dissolved into nothing. Corporal James Whitfield stared at a shelf of military history books, now reduced to blank-paged husks, their spines still intact, but their words completely erased. "It's not just personal stuff," Whitfield said quietly. "I checked online, Wikipedia, the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian database, everything wiped. Ancient history, the world wars, the moon landing, all of it, clean." Brett moved to the command center. Lieutenant Cole Hargrove, the base intelligence officer, was already at his station with 3 monitors running emergency diagnostics. Cole was the kind of man who never panicked. He cataloged. And what he was cataloging right now made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "It wasn't a hack," Cole said without looking up. "No virus, no EMP. The data didn't corrupt, it was extracted. Whatever did this used a field-based removal system operating on both digital and molecular levels simultaneously. Paper, stone carvings, painted murals, digital servers, every physical and digital record on Earth, gone, in a 6-hour window while most of the country slept." "Extracted by who?" Brett asked. Cole pulled up a signal map. Deep red pulse signatures bloomed across every continent, each one originating from the upper atmosphere. Brett stared at the map for a long moment. "How high up?" Brett said. "Low orbit," Cole replied. "Multiple vessels, massive displacement signatures. Sir, whatever is up there did not come from this planet. No official orders had come down from command. No president had addressed the nation. The world was still in that fragile, breathless 30-second window between the moment everything changes and the moment people realize it has changed." Brett Calloway used those 30 seconds well. "Full alert," he said, his voice flat and certain. "Every man armed, every system live. Get me aligned to the Pentagon, and if the Pentagon doesn't answer, get me aligned to whoever does." Outside, the sky that had looked so normal began to change. A deep geometric shadow moved across the Kansas plains, slow, deliberate, and vast. It blocked the morning sun the way a continent-sized storm cloud might, except it had edges, sharp, structured, mathematical edges, the kind that nature never makes. Daniel Hayes stepped outside and looked up. His jaw tightened. He had no words for what he was seeing. Humans never did, the first time. He went back inside, picked up his rifle, and stood next to his commander. That was the first sign the aliens had made a mistake. Because across every continent, in every language, in every culture, the same thing was happening. Soldiers were picking up rifles. Farmers were standing in doorways, watching the shadows move. Old men who had survived other impossible things were looking at the sky with an expression that was not fear. It was recognition. The aliens had erased humanity's written history. But written history was never where the real danger lived. In Washington, D.C., the first alien transmission was received at 7:42 a.m. Eastern Time. It came through every frequency simultaneously: radio, cellular, digital, and somehow through the walls of every structure on Earth as a low vibration that people felt more than heard. The translation software the aliens had already loaded into human communication networks rendered it instantly in clean, unaccented English. People of Earth, your historical records have been archived for study. Resistance to occupation is statistically non-viable. You have been assessed as a pre-category civilizational unit. Comply with relocation protocols, and biological preservation will be guaranteed. Brett listened to the transmission in the command center, surrounded by 30 soldiers whose faces had moved past shock and straight into something harder. He waited until the message finished. Then he picked up the base-wide intercom. "Listen up," he said, his voice carrying through every hallway, every barrack, every room in Fort Harlow. "They took our books. They think that means they took us. Let's show them the difference." It was something quieter and far more dangerous. The sound of weapons being checked, loaded, and readied. Above Kansas, the alien command ship registered no significant military mobilization from the Fort Harlow installation. Their threat assessment algorithms categorized it as a low-priority provincial outpost. They had other continents to process. That miscalculation would cost them everything. But neither Brett Calloway nor the aliens yet understood what had been set in motion the moment 8 billion people woke up and discovered that someone had tried to erase who they were. Because something ancient and biological had just been activated inside the human species, something that had not been needed for a very, very long time. The first 72 hours after the Great Erasure were chaos. But not the kind the aliens had planned for. Their models had predicted social collapse, riots over resources, governmental paralysis, a species stumbling blind without the guideposts of its recorded civilization. What their models had not accounted for was the specific way humans respond to collective loss. They do not collapse. They gather. Across the United States, within hours of the erasure, people began moving toward each other, not away. Neighbors who had never spoken knocked on each other's doors. Veterans who had stored physical knowledge in muscle and bone started teaching anyone who would listen. Mechanics showed engineers. Farmers showed city planners. Old women who had memorized recipes, prayers, and folk remedies became the most important people in their communities overnight. At Fort Harlow, Brett Calloway established the first formal resistance council within 48 hours. He called it simple. The table. 8 men around a folding conference table in the command center. Maps spread out, radio traffic crackling, coffee going cold in styrofoam cups. What do we actually know? Brett started every meeting the same way. Cole Hargrove spread a composite image across the table, pieced together from satellite feeds that were still partially operational. The alien fleet numbered at least 60 vessels in low Earth orbit, with 3 massive ships, what Cole called anchor ships, positioned over North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia, respectively. Each one stretched roughly 4 kilometers in length. They were not weapons platforms. They were administration ships. "They're not here to destroy us," Cole said, tracing the outline of the nearest vessel. "They're here to process us. This is a bureaucratic operation to them. We're cargo." "Then let's be the cargo that fights back," said Sergeant Hayes. The problem was, conventional military doctrine was essentially useless. Every strategic playbook, every war college manual, every tactical database, gone with the erasure. And even before the erasure, no human military had ever planned for an adversary with orbital superiority, molecular extraction technology, and the ability to intercept standard communications. But Brett Calloway had something the aliens had not modeled for. 30 years of watching human beings improvise under pressure. "We stop using doctrine," he said simply. "Doctrine is what they expected us to have. We use instinct." It sounded crazy. It turned out to be the most strategically sound decision made in the first phase of the resistance. Without written records to reference, human commanders across the continent began operating purely on adaptive reasoning and direct experience, and something extraordinary started happening. Units that had never trained together began coordinating with an efficiency that made no statistical sense. A resistance cell in Colorado communicated with one in Tennessee through coded radio bursts that both groups claimed to have independently invented. A tactical pattern used by a militia group in rural Ohio was spontaneously mirrored by a completely isolated unit in northern Montana 3 days later. Lieutenant Cole Hargrove noticed it first. He called Brett to his station at 2 a.m. on the 4th day. "Look at this," Cole said, pulling up the radio traffic analysis. "These formations, these movement patterns, they're converging. Different groups, no contact with each other, no shared doctrine, and they're arriving at the same tactics independently." Brett studied the data. "Coincidence? I'm a statistician, sir. This is not coincidence. Something is coordinating these groups that isn't radio communication, isn't written orders, and isn't shared training." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, not yet. On day 5, Dr. Marcus Webb arrived at Fort Harlow. He had driven 400 miles from the University of Colorado's neuroscience department, carrying hard-copy research notes he had handwritten years before in a private journal, one of the few documents to survive the erasure only because it had been stored in a lead-lined safe originally built for nuclear emergency protocols. Webb was thin, exhausted, and absolutely electric with urgency. "Commander Calloway," he said, before he had even properly introduced himself, "I need to show you what's happening to human brain activity under sustained historical deprivation. Because what I'm seeing in my data, it changes everything about how you need to think about this war." Brett looked at him for a moment. Then he pointed at a chair. "Sit down, Doctor. Start talking." Webb spread his handwritten notes across the table. The data was raw. Field observations, self-reported behavioral changes, and 3 cases of direct neurological scanning he had managed to conduct before the aliens had disabled most electronic medical equipment. "The prefrontal cortex," Webb said, pointing to a hand-drawn diagram. "It's showing activation patterns we have never recorded in any living human subject. Ancient patterns. Patterns we've only seen in fossil records of early Homo sapiens neural structure reconstructions. The brain, under the stress of losing its cultural memory, is reaching backward. It's activating something that's been dormant for tens of thousands of years." "What is it?" Brett asked. Webb looked up from his notes. "We don't have a clinical name for it yet, but the closest description I can give you is ancestral threat response architecture. The brain is essentially rebooting to a version of itself that predates civilization, the version that kept our species alive when there were no books, no cities, no accumulated knowledge, the version that survived everything." The room was very quiet. "And that version," Brett said slowly, "is better at fighting?" "That version," Webb said, "is better at surviving, which in this context means the same thing." Outside Fort Harlow, the alien processing drones had begun their first pass over the Kansas plains, slow-moving collection vehicles designed to catalog and prepare human populations for relocation. They were efficient, methodical machines built on the assumption that the species below them was disoriented, leaderless, and psychologically broken. The first drone that came within range of Fort Harlow was destroyed by a jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse device that Corporal James Whitfield had built from memory, spare parts, and 3 days of focused rage. It was the first human counterattack in the war. It was crude, it was improvised, it was devastating in its implications. The aliens logged the incident as an anomaly. Their models suggested it would not be repeated. Their models were catastrophically wrong. And deep in the Kansas Command Center, Brett Calloway was already planning what came next. With 30 soldiers, a neurologist's impossible data, and the growing certainty that humanity had not lost its greatest weapon when it lost its books. By the end of the second week, the alien commanders convened an emergency session aboard their primary anchor ship, positioned over the American continent. It was the first time in 412 conquest operations that such a session had been required this early in a processing cycle. High Commander Veth Solon stood at the center of the command amphitheater, his elongated frame still beneath the cold white light of the vessel's interior. Around him, the senior alien administrative staff waited for his assessment. They were patient beings by nature. Their civilization was old enough that patience had become biological. Veth Solon did not look patient. The human resistance cells are multiplying, said the operations analyst, whose specific role was to track conquered species' behavioral deviation from projections. Current count stands at 417 coordinated groups across the North American landmass alone. Global estimates suggest over 3,000 cells in active operation. That is mathematically inconsistent, said another administrator. The species has no communication network that survived our suppression protocols. They have no shared doctrine. They have no historical records from which to derive tactical frameworks. Coordination at this scale requires infrastructure we have eliminated. And yet, the analyst said quietly. Veth Solon turned to the biological assessment officer. Explain. The assessment officer, a specialist who had studied 230 conquered species, pulled up a holographic display of human neural mapping data extracted during the erasure process. When we removed their cultural memory, she said carefully, we assumed we were removing their strategic capacity. The human brain is demonstrating activation in regions that predate their recorded civilization by approximately 40,000 years. They are not operating from memory. They are operating from something older. The amphitheater was quiet for a long moment. Older, Veth Solon repeated. Their threat response architecture does not require learned knowledge to activate. It requires loss. Specifically, collective loss. The more uniformly they suffer, the more precisely their biological systems synchronize. She paused. We created the exact conditions required to activate it. Veth Solon processed this information with the stillness of his ancient species. Then he said, increase processing speed. Complete the relocation of high population centers within 72 hours. Reduce the window in which this synchronization can develop further. None of them understood yet that 72 hours was already too late. At Fort Harlow, Brett Calloway spread a hand-drawn map across the table. It was a masterpiece of improvisation, compiled from soldier memories, civilian reports, and Cole Hargrove's meticulous observation of alien movement patterns. There were no printed maps left. This one existed only because 20 men had sat in a room for 6 hours and reconstructed it from what they collectively remembered. The alien ships have a blind spot, Cole said, pressing his finger against the map. Their sensor arrays are calibrated for electronic signals, radio, digital, satellite. They are not calibrated for humans moving on foot, in small groups, without any electronic equipment, communicating through physical means. They built their surveillance system to track a technological civilization, Brett said. They have no model for what we look like when we go primitive. Brett looked at his men, Sergeant Daniel Hayes, Corporal James Whitfield, Private Aaron Mercer, 28 more behind them, each one carrying something irreplaceable in their head and hands. Whitfield knew electrical engineering. Hayes knew field surgery from 2 combat deployments. Mercer, barely 23, had grown up hunting in rural Georgia and could move through terrain without leaving a trace that most modern soldiers couldn't manage with a week of training. We go dark, Brett said. All electronics off. We move on foot. We communicate through runners and hand signals. We become something their sensors were not built to see. That's not modern warfare, Hayes said. No, Brett agreed. It's older than that. The blank slate protocol, as Cole Hargrove named it, was implemented within 24 hours across Fort Harlow's operational radius. And within 48 hours, through the same inexplicable synchronization that had been baffling the aliens, variants of the same protocol appeared spontaneously in resistance cells across Ohio, Tennessee, Montana, and the Pacific Northwest. No one had transmitted the idea. No one had sent orders. Humans, stripped of their technological civilization, had independently arrived at the same survival strategy. Because it was not a learned strategy. It was a remembered one, stored not in books or databases, but in the oldest parts of the human nervous system. Dr. Marcus Webb documented it in his journal, with a hand that trembled slightly from exhaustion and awe. "They didn't erase our history," he wrote. "They excavated it." The first major coordinated resistance action took place on day 19. 12 cells across the Kansas-Missouri corridor, none of them in electronic contact with each other, simultaneously struck alien processing drone convoys moving through their respective regions. The timing was not perfect, but it was close enough to overwhelm alien response protocols, which had been calibrated for threats from single centralized military units, not decentralized, instinct-driven human swarms. Brett's team took down 3 drones. The teams in Missouri took 4. 2 cells in the southern corridor took down 5 between them before alien counter-response units arrived. 14 drones destroyed in 6 hours across 300 miles of territory by groups that had never communicated, never coordinated, and never trained together. The alien anchor ship above North America filed an emergency recalculation request to their central command. It was the 413th conquest operation in their history. It was the first time an emergency recalculation had ever been filed before the initial processing cycle was complete. Veth Solon stood at his observation port and looked down at the continent below. The lights of human cities, partially restored by improvised power solutions his analysts still did not fully understand, glittered across the darkness like a constellation that refused to go out. "They are not coordinating through technology," he said quietly to no one in particular. "They are coordinating through something we cannot intercept." Behind him, the biological assessment officer said nothing. But her expression communicated something she had not yet put into her official report: fear. And 200 miles below, in a command center lit by emergency generators and the focused intensity of men who had stopped being afraid, Brett Calloway looked at his map and said 5 words that would become the first battle cry of the human resistance. Spoken quietly, without drama, the way the most dangerous things always are. The plan to reach the anchor ship was built from 3 things: a neurologist's impossible data, a corporal's electromagnetic genius, and 30 years of a commander's accumulated understanding of how humans fight when their backs are against the wall. Brett Calloway called it Operation Ancestral. The aliens would have no name for it in their records, because their record-keeping systems were about to have much larger problems. The core insight was simple and devastating in its elegance. The alien anchor ships maintained constant low-altitude atmospheric management drones that regulated the electromagnetic suppression field, keeping human communications dark. Those drones operated on a narrowband frequency that Whitfield had isolated through 3 weeks of careful observation. Destroy the right drones in the right sequence, and the suppression field would develop gaps, momentary windows through which a signal could punch upward, not a weapon signal. Something far more dangerous. "We're going to transmit the web data," Cole Hargrove said, laying out the plan to the assembled table. "Every neurological scan, every behavioral synchronization pattern, every piece of evidence showing what the erasure actually triggered inside us. We get that data to every resistance cell on the continent simultaneously, and we make sure the aliens hear it too." Brett looked at him. "Why do we want them to hear it?" "Because right now, their behavioral models still show us as a species in collapse. The moment they understand what's actually happening, what we've actually become, they will have to choose between 2 options: escalate to full planetary destruction, which their own administrative charter prohibits, or retreat and recalibrate." Cole paused. "Either way, it buys us time. And time is what humans do best." Daniel Hayes leaned forward. "What if they choose a third option? What if they just push harder? Then we make sure we've already hit them hard enough that harder doesn't help them," Brett said. The operation launched at 0300 hours on day 26. 12 teams, moving entirely on foot through the Kansas darkness, each carrying the specific equipment needed to take down 1 atmospheric drone in the suppression network. Whitfield had trained each team personally, 6 hours per group, knowledge transferred entirely by demonstration, because there was no written manual left, and no digital training system still operational. They moved like something ancient and patient and completely without fear. The alien atmospheric drones were sophisticated machines, but they were calibrated to detect electronic threats, targeting systems, weapons locks, signal intrusions. They were not calibrated to detect 12 groups of human beings walking quietly through darkness, carrying jury-rigged pulse emitters built from salvaged components. At 0347, the first drone fell. It simply went dark. No explosion, no dramatic cascade. One moment it was maintaining its suppression field node, the next it was a piece of inert metal descending slowly through the atmosphere. Whitfield's EMP design was clean, precise, and completely invisible to the alien monitoring systems, which were looking for the wrong kind of signal. At 0351, the second drone fell, then the third, 3 minutes later. By 0412, 9 of the 12 target drones had been neutralized, and the suppression field above the Kansas-Missouri corridor had developed a gap 400 miles wide. Cole Hargrove, seated at a field radio station in the Fort Harlow Command Center, began transmitting. The web data went out in a compressed burst, all of it, every scan, every observation, every documented instance of the human synchronization phenomenon. It went to every resistance cell frequency Cole had cataloged over the past 4 weeks, and it went upward, through the gap, toward the anchor ship. The response from the resistance cells was immediate and electric. Units that had been operating in isolation suddenly understood the framework for what they had been experiencing. The unexplained coordination, the tactical mirroring, the sense that they were somehow part of something larger than their individual cells. Webb's data gave it language, and language, even stripped of written records, is one of the things humans never lose. Within 6 hours of the transmission, 47 resistance cells had independently launched coordinated strikes against alien processing infrastructure in their regions. The timing was not perfect, but the scale was unprecedented, the largest single-day resistance action since the erasure began, executed without centralized command, without digital coordination, and without a single written order. Aboard the anchor ship, High Commander Veth Solon received the web data transmission simultaneously with the attack reports. He stood very still for a long time, reading the analysis of what the erasure had triggered inside the human species. Then he said, quietly, "We made them stronger." The biological assessment officer, standing beside him, said nothing. There was nothing to say. "Initiate full planetary pacification protocols," Veth Solon said. "Sir," said the operations analyst carefully, "full pacification is a charter violation." "Central Command will understand," Veth Solon said, "when they see what we are dealing with." But the cumulative result, the result that emerged from dozens of independent human minds operating on instinct and ancestral pattern recognition, was a perfectly coordinated attack on a critical system. Veth Solon looked at the damage report. Then he looked at the web data again. Then he understood, with the slow, cold clarity of a species that had never before encountered anything it could not model, exactly what it had done. "They planned this without planning it," he said, and the lights on the anchor ship above Kansas flickered for the first time in its 4-century operational history. Below, Brett Calloway stood outside Fort Harlow and looked up at the enormous shadow in the sky. He watched the flicker. He didn't smile. He just turned back inside and said, "Part 2. Now, the Alien Full Pacification Protocol was designed for exactly this kind of situation. A conquered species displaying unexpected resistance capacity. It had been deployed 11 times in 400 conquest operations, and it had worked 11 times. The protocol involved targeted atmospheric strikes on resistance concentrations, followed by accelerated relocation of compliant populations to remove the human resource base from which resistance drew its strength. It was ruthless, it was efficient, it was built on the assumption that resistance was a military problem. Brett Calloway had spent 3 days anticipating it. "They will hit the known resistance concentrations first," he told his table, "the morning after the drone strikes. Anywhere we visibly operated, anywhere their sensors can identify organized human activity. Then we need to not be there," Hayes said. "We need to be everywhere they don't expect, all at once." The dispersal began within hours. Fort Harlow's 30 soldiers scattered across a 200-mile radius in groups of 2 and 3, small enough to be invisible to alien sensors, large enough to be effective. Each group carried only what they could memorize and carry. Each group had a target, not alien military infrastructure, but alien administrative infrastructure. The processing stations, the cataloging nodes, the biological assessment centers where alien teams were preparing human populations for relocation. Brett's personal team was himself, Hayes, and Whitfield, 3 men and whatever they carried in their hands and heads, moving through the Kansas grasslands toward the nearest alien ground processing station, 12 miles outside the city of Salina. They moved at night. They spoke in whispers. They navigated by stars, because none of them had grown up doing it, but all of them had read enough once to know the basics, and the basics were enough. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Whitfield said, as they moved through the darkness. "Tell me," Brett said. "My dad used to say that the difference between a soldier and a warrior is that a soldier fights for a cause, and a warrior fights for the people next to him." Whitfield paused. "I used to think that was just something old men said. Now, I think it's the most strategically important sentence I've ever heard." Hayes, moving quietly on Brett's left, said nothing, but his hand tightened briefly on his rifle. They reached the processing station at 0230. It was a prefabricated alien structure, modular, efficient, and designed for rapid deployment on newly acquired worlds. 4 alien administrative staff inside. 2 external automated sentinels calibrated for electronic threat detection. Whitfield's EMP took the sentinels down in 40 seconds. What happened next was not a battle. It was a retrieval. Inside the processing station's data archive, the one piece of alien infrastructure that maintained a localized power supply independent of the atmospheric network, was something extraordinary. Cole had theorized it, Webb had suspected it, but seeing it confirmed stopped Brett cold for a full 3 seconds. The aliens had not destroyed Earth's historical records. They had archived them. Every book, every document, every photograph and film reel and digital file, all of it, compressed into alien data crystals and stored aboard the processing stations for later study. "They took our history," Hayes said quietly, staring at the archive wall, "and kept it." "Of course they did," Brett said, recovering. "We're cargo to them. You catalog it." He pulled out the field transmitter Cole had configured specifically for this possibility. The transmission was simple. Coordinates, confirmation code, 3 words, "We found them." Across the continent, in the same 6-hour window, 23 other resistance teams reached 23 other processing stations. 19 of them found the same thing, 19 archives. 19 collections of humanity's stolen memory, sitting in alien storage, waiting to be shipped off-world. The web data had done its work. The synchronization was real, it was accelerating, and it was now operating at a scale that the alien commanders had no framework to address. The full pacification strikes launched at 0400, precision atmospheric weapons, targeted at the coordinates where resistance activity had been detected. They hit empty ground. Fort Harlow evacuated. Every major resistance concentration dispersed. The alien weapons struck buildings, fields, and infrastructure with mathematical precision and found almost nothing human to hit. Veth Solon watched the strike reports come in with an expression his staff had never seen on him before. He was a being from a civilization old enough to have forgotten what it felt like to be surprised. He was relearning. They anticipated the strikes, the operations analyst said unnecessarily. They did not anticipate them, Veth Solon said. They assumed them. There is a difference. He turned from the display. A species that anticipates needs intelligence. A species that assumes operates from pattern recognition so deep it has become instinct. He was quiet for a moment. We have been treating them as a technological civilization temporarily deprived of its technology. They have become something else. What do we do, sir? The analyst asked. Veth Solon looked at the transmission logs, showing the web data broadcast. He looked at the 19 processing stations reporting simultaneous retrieval actions. He looked at the pacification strike reports, showing nothing but empty Earth. Contact Central Command, he said. Tell them we require a full strategic reassessment. It was the first time in 412 operations that those words had ever been spoken from a command ship. And on the ground below, in the pre-dawn darkness of the Kansas plains, Brett Calloway stood over an alien data crystal the size of his fist that contained, according to the Archive Index, the complete digital collection of the Library of Congress. He held it for a moment. Then he looked at Hayes. "We got them," Hayes said. "Not yet," Brett said. "But we will." The aliens withdrew from Earth's orbit on day 41. It was not a retreat in the traditional military sense. What Veth Solon filed with Central Command was a strategic suspension pending complete species reassessment. The 60 vessels in low Earth orbit powered down their atmospheric suppression fields, gathered their remaining processing drones, and moved to a position beyond the Moon's orbit, far enough to observe, close enough to reconsider. They left the archives behind, not out of generosity, out of the sudden cold understanding that taking them had been the original mistake, and that every moment they remained in the possession of alien assets was another moment the Human Synchronization Network had a focal point to organize around. Brett Calloway received the news from Cole Hargrove at 0600 on a Tuesday morning. Cole's voice over the field radio was the flattest it had ever been, the specific flatness of a man trying to be precise about something that kept wanting to be enormous. Atmospheric suppression fields are down across all monitored frequencies. Drone activity has ceased. The 3 anchor ships are moving to lunar standoff distance. A pause. "Sir, I think they're leaving." Brett was outside when he heard it, standing in the Kansas grassland, watching the first clean sunrise in 41 days. The massive geometric shadow that had been sitting over the plains since the beginning was gone. Just pale morning light, coming over the flat horizon, the way it had come over that same horizon for 10,000 years before the aliens arrived. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to find his men. The reunion at Fort Harlow took 3 days. Soldiers returning from their dispersal positions, civilians emerging from improvised shelters, resistance cells making their way toward the coordinates that Cole was broadcasting on newly restored radio frequencies. People walked miles. Some drove vehicles that had been hidden and shielded from alien sensors for weeks. Some arrived on horseback, because horses were one of the things the aliens had not thought to consider. Marcus Webb arrived on the second day, thinner than he had been and carrying his journal like it was the most important object on Earth, which, in a very real sense, it was. "I want to show you something," he said to Brett, and opened the journal to a page covered in careful handwriting. "In the last week, I've been documenting the synchronization patterns as they developed. The neuroempathy link. The mechanism by which resistance cells were coordinating without communication technology." He pointed to a series of diagrams. "It's not fading. Now that the suppression field is gone and people can communicate again, I expected the biological mechanism to go dormant. It hasn't." Brett looked at the diagrams. "What does that mean?" "It means we didn't just survive the erasure," Webb said. "We evolved through it. Humanity today is neurologically different from humanity 41 days ago. The ancestral architecture that activated under stress, it's integrated now. It's part of us in a way it wasn't before." Brett was quiet for a long moment. Around them, Fort Harlow was alive with the specific energy of people who have come through something terrible and are still standing. Men were laughing too loudly. Women were embracing too long. Children who had spent 41 days in silence were running and making noise the way children are supposed to. "Is that good or bad?" Brett asked. Webb smiled for the first time since Brett had known him. "I genuinely don't know yet, but I know this. The galaxy has spent 400 conquest operations learning what civilizations look like after they fall. They've never had to learn what a civilization looks like after it refuses to. The recovery of Earth's historical archives took 6 weeks. The alien processing stations had been built for durability, and once human engineers began working through them with the same improvised genius that had characterized the entire resistance, the data crystals proved remarkably accessible. Libraries began restoring their collections, universities rebuilt their databases, museums recovered their records. But something had changed in how humans related to that history. Where before the erasure, history had often felt like something that existed in the past, preserved in books, archived in databases, studied in classrooms. It now felt like something that lived inside people. Webb's research, which became the most widely read scientific document in human history within a year of the erasure, demonstrated what humanity had learned at tremendous cost: that the real repository of human civilization had never been its libraries. It had been its people. Commander Brett Calloway was called to Washington in the weeks following the withdrawal to brief the reconstituted government on the military analysis of the alien engagement. He sat in front of a committee of senators, generals, and intelligence officials, all of them looking at him with the particular expression of people who need to understand something that doesn't fit any existing category. He kept his briefing simple. They took everything we'd written down, he said. They thought that was our strength. It wasn't. Our strength is what we do when we have nothing left but each other. They gave us exactly those conditions, and they were not prepared for the result. A senator leaned forward. What do we do if they come back? Brett looked at him steadily. They won't, he said. Not soon, and not the same way. How can you be sure? Because they're a civilization that learns from data. And the data they collected on us for 41 days, the data they didn't plan to collect, the data that came from watching us respond to what they did to us, that data is the most dangerous thing they've ever brought back to their home command. He paused. They went out to catalog cargo. They came back with evidence that the cargo bites back in ways that don't show up in any of their models. That takes time to process, time to prepare for. He looked around the room. We should use that time better than they expect us to. Above Earth at lunar standoff distance, the alien anchor ship maintained its observation position. That Solon stood at his observation port and watched the blue-white planet below, the lights of its cities growing brighter as human civilization restored itself with a speed his analysts still could not fully explain. The biological assessment officer stood beside him. Central Command is requesting a full timeline for resuming operations, she said. Tell them the assessment is ongoing, Vet Solon said. She was quiet for a moment. That is the same answer you gave them last week. Yes, he said. She waited, he kept watching the planet. Finally she said carefully. Sir, are we afraid of them? Vet Solon considered the question with the patience of his ancient species. He thought about 412 conquest operations. He thought about a species that had responded to the theft of its entire written history by becoming something older and more dangerous than it had ever been. He thought about 30 humans in a Kansas command center who had not panicked, had not collapsed, had not done any of the things 400 conquest operations had taught him that species do. We are cautious of them, he said finally. There is a distinction. But what his face communicated in the deep silence that followed was something else entirely. On Earth, in the weeks and months that followed, humans did something the aliens had not predicted and still could not model. They told the story, not in official reports or academic papers, though those came too, but in the specific way humans have always transmitted the things that matter most, around fires, at kitchen tables. In the words of parents to children at bedtime, and old soldiers to young ones in quiet moments, and strangers to strangers who had been through the same thing. They told the story of the 41 days when someone tried to erase them and found out that you cannot erase a species by taking its books. Because the books were never where the real story lived. HFY Endurance Tales. If you stayed through every single moment of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Drop a comment below and tell me, which moment hit you hardest? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because stories like this one are how we remember what we are actually made of. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because the next chapter is coming, and you do not want to miss what humanity does next. Now, for the first time in galactic history, they had reason to watch carefully. Because humanity had written its new first chapter, not in books, and not in stone. In fire, in blood, in the unbreakable fact of 8 billion people, who when given nothing left to lose, had chosen each other. And the galaxy would not forget it.